War was a constant reality in ancient Rome, and at the heart of every battle stood the Roman warriors, disciplined, strategic, and always prepared. But staying battle-ready wasn't just about training. It was also about proper nutrition. But what exactly did they eat? And how did their diet give them an advantage in war? Their choices might surprise you. The Roman army was powerful and well organized, with different types of soldiers. The legionaries were the main soldiers, equipped with swords, shields, and javelins. The auxiliaries were non-Roman fighters, who had special skills like archery, riding horses, or building things. At the top were the praetorians, elite guards whose main job was to protect the emperor. Without modern nutrition science, Roman commanders had to rely on experience to determine what kept their soldiers strong and battle-ready. So, what was on the menu for these warriors? A Roman soldier's diet was surprisingly simple yet effective. They ate wheat, often turned into porridge or bread, smoked or fresh meat, usually pork, vegetables, legumes, cheese, vinegar, olive oil, and of course, wine. These rations were carefully calculated, issued several times a week, and even deducted from their pay, because even warriors had expenses. So basically, Roman soldiers didn't exactly get free food, and they had to budget their wages carefully. So, how did the Roman army keep its soldiers fed? Maintaining an army of thousands required careful planning, and the Romans, known for their logistical genius, developed a permanent system of military food warehouses, starting from the time of Emperor Julius Caesar. These food bases were strategically placed in warehouses near towns, ensuring a steady supply of grain, meat, and other essentials. But have you wondered how and when these Roman soldiers got their food? Unlike modern armies with daily meals served in mess halls, Roman soldiers received their rations only on specific days, with enough provisions to last for weeks at a time. During peacetime, or when stationed in one place, food was distributed in bulk, sometimes covering 12, 20, or even 30 days. Can you picture having to carefully ration your food for an entire month? Would you have managed, or would you have run out too soon? And the distribution process? It was highly organized. Soldiers gathered in formation, century by century, while their names were called one by one. Each man stepped forward, collected his share, and carried it back to his tent. It was a disciplined, almost ceremonial process, and army leaders made sure to be present to reinforce their role as breadwinners for the troops. After all, keeping an army fed was just as important as keeping them armed. But do you know who was actually in charge of food distribution? While top commanders were there for show, the real responsibility fell to the army tribunes. In many cases, one tribune was specifically assigned to oversee the military's food supply, ensuring that everything was accounted for. And the Romans, being as meticulous as they were, had a system to prevent fraud or mistakes. Archaeologists have even discovered weights stamped with legionary symbols, probably used to measure food rations accurately. They've also found large seals marked with the symbols of specific cohorts and centuries. These were probably used to label and track provisions, making sure that every soldier got exactly what he was owed. Most times, on the march, soldiers carried their own rations, called cibaria, enough to sustain them for 2 to 3 days. Salted meat, hardtack biscuits, cheese, and olive oil were their survival staples when fresh supplies were unavailable. But what happened when soldiers were on the move or deep in enemy territory? Requisitions were the answer, but don't mistake them for looting. Unlike pillaging armies that simply took what they wanted, Roman military commanders followed a more organized approach. They formally demanded provisions from local authorities who were expected to release food from civilian warehouses. In return, they received application slips, essentially ancient receipts, allowing them to claim compensation later. This method helped keep the army fed without completely turning local populations against them, at least in theory. Today, a high-carb diet might seem unusual for soldiers, but for the Romans, grains were essential. In a time when physical strength and endurance meant survival, their meals were built to fuel stamina and keep them ready for battle. Just like Roman civilians, soldiers relied heavily on wheat, but they took it a step further. Their go-to meal? Pulse, a a hearty porridge made by boiling wheat or barley with water or milk, sometimes sweetened with honey or spiced for flavor. It was the perfect energy boost before a long day of training or combat. But it didn't stop there. Wheat was also transformed into bread, soups, stews, and even an early form of pasta. A typical daily grain ration for an army was around 830 grams of wheat or barley, but it wasn't delivered as flour. Why? Because whole grain spoiled much slower, making it a more reliable food source for long campaigns. Each soldier received about 66 pounds of wheat per month, but here's the catch. The grain was issued whole. That meant every soldier had to mill and prepare his own food, often working with his squad, contubernium, to grind the grain, mix it with water and spices, and roast it over an open fire. Cavalry soldiers, riders, got even more grain, not just for themselves, but to feed their horses. In total, a Roman soldier's diet was about 75% grain and 25% other goods, like vegetables, meat, and cheese. Not exactly a varied menu, but it kept them marching. But not everyone ate the same. Rank had its privileges. Higher-ranking officers, including centurions and ensigns, received larger and better quality rations. This distinction even showed up in the Roman language. Ordinary soldiers took food, cibum capere, while officers ate dinner, epulare, a far more refined way of describing mealtime. Even famously disciplined leaders weren't above bringing personal chefs to war. Take Cato the Younger, a man known for his strictness and frugality, who still made sure to bring his best baker and cook on campaign. After all, even the toughest warriors appreciated a well-cooked meal. Unlike modern armies with centralized mess halls, Roman military camps had no large-scale kitchens. Every meal was a hands-on task. Can you imagine today's soldiers grinding their own flour before heading into battle? The discipline of the Roman army extended far beyond the battlefield. It was ingrained in every aspect of their daily lives, right down to their food. Yes, the Roman army ran on discipline, strategy, and surprisingly, a whole lot of grain. But did you know that the type of grain a soldier ate could reflect his status, or even be used as a punishment? Wheat was the staple of a Roman soldier's diet, but not all wheat was created equal. In Rome itself, soldiers ate varieties like emmer, spelt, and millet, while those stationed in colder regions, such as Gaul, relied on heartier grains like rye and barley. But barley had a stigma. It was considered food for animals and barbarians. If a soldier received a barley ration instead of wheat, it wasn't just a dietary switch. It was a punishment. Oats were even lower on the hierarchy, eaten only in times of desperation. On the march, Roman soldiers carried hardtack biscuits known as bucellatum or panis militaris, rock hard, long-lasting, and about as appetizing as it sounds. It was made of flour, salt, and water. This twice-baked military ration could last for months without spoiling, making it perfect for soldiers on the move. Ever wondered where the name came from? It's actually linked to bucellari, the mercenary soldiers of the empire, proof that this simple biscuit was essential fuel for Rome's warriors. To make them edible, soldiers often dunked them in wine or broth. Fortunately, the army also had mobile bread ovens, furciferi, allowing them to bake fresh bread when possible. But forget the soft, airy texture of modern loaves. This was dense, coarse, and built for survival. With each soldier consuming about a third of a ton of grain per year, the Roman military machine wasn't just fueled by tactics and training. It was powered by carbs. But grains alone weren't enough to keep Roman soldiers marching. Meat, especially pork, was a key part of their diet. In fact, bacon was often part of a soldier's daily ration. Smoked for easy transport and loaded with fat and calories, it gave them the energy needed for long, grueling campaigns. Romans favoured pork over beef, but when supplies ran low, they weren't picky. In well-stocked regions, they seized cattle, sheep, and goats from locales. But in tougher places like Britain, they had to get creative, eating whatever they could catch, from rabbits and ducks to foxes, and even moles. Still, meat wasn't a daily treat. Because of supply challenges, soldiers mostly lived on grains, legumes, and cheese, turning to fresh meat only when it was available. When they did get it, they made the most of it, roasting, boiling, or cooking it into stews to stretch it further. But how important was meat in a Roman soldier's diet? Surprisingly, it made up less than a quarter of their daily calorie intake. Even so, it remained a vital source of protein and energy. When food was scarce, soldiers had to hunt on foxes, deer, hares, badgers, wild oxen, and even field mice and beavers. Of course, poultry was also part of the Roman soldiers' diet. Ducks, chickens, geese, even ravens could end up in the cooking pot, but a strong body needed more than just meat. A balanced diet was essential, which is why vegetables played such an important role. Hearty staples like onions, leeks, garlic, cabbage, carrots, and turnips were common. These were eaten raw, boiled, or thrown into stews, delivering the vitamins and minerals needed to keep soldiers healthy and battle-ready. Garlic, in particular, was a favorite, not just for its bold flavor, but also for its supposed healing properties. Could this have been the Roman version of a superfood? But meat came with a serious problem: spoilage, especially during hot desert campaigns where food could rot fast. The solution? Salt. Every soldier carried a ration of salt, essential for preserving food and preventing illness, which could spread quickly through an army. Salt was so important that the Romans even established military salt works in areas without easy access to seawater. So yes, Roman soldiers had their wheat and bacon, but one of their most essential and often overlooked food sources was legumes. Beans, lentils, and chickpeas were staples in a soldier's diet, providing a rich source of plant-based protein. These hardy ingredients were easy to store and transport, making them perfect for an army constantly on the move. But how did they prepare them? Often they were simmered into hearty stews or mixed with grains to create a filling, energy-boosting meal. And then there's cheese, a true Roman favorite. If you visit Italy today, it's nearly impossible to leave without tasting its famous cheeses. But did you know that Roman soldiers were making and eating cheese over 2,000 years ago? Cheese provided essential fats that helped build disease resistance and maintain longevity. Pretty useful when you're constantly battling enemies and harsh conditions. Since many soldiers owned livestock, they often made their own cheese from fresh milk. However, the Romans weren't big fans of cow's milk, so most of their cheese came from sheep or goats. But in northern Europe, where cattle were more common, soldiers adapted and made cheese from cow's milk. Have you ever wondered how different regions developed their unique cheese traditions, though? You can thank the Romans. As they expanded their empire, they taught conquered peoples the art of cheese making, introducing techniques like using rennet to separate curds from whey. While the French and Northern Europeans had only soft cheeses that spoiled quickly, Roman innovations allowed for cheeses that improved with age. Smoked cheeses were also popular, offering a longer shelf life and perfect for soldiers needing durable rations. But here's where it gets more interesting. Do you know that Roman soldiers actually had access to luxury foods? Well, surprisingly yes, especially the officers. Archaeologists have even uncovered evidence at several Roman army camps showing that, beyond the standard rations, soldiers could buy finer imported ingredients like coriander, oysters, and even exotic spices such as pepper from India. But what about the most crucial survival resource, water? A Roman soldier could drink anywhere from 2 to 8 liters, half to 2 gallons, of water per day, depending on the climate and physical demands. However, keeping a steady supply of fresh water was no easy task. Water was often stored in barrels, but over time, it could become stale or even contaminated. So how did the Romans deal with this problem? The answer was posca, a practical and refreshing drink made by mixing vinegar, water, and herbs. The vinegar not only masked the taste of questionable water, but also had mild antiseptic properties, reducing the risk of illness. It wasn't just a military staple. Urban poor and enslaved people also drank posca because it was cheap, long-lasting, and even believed to have healing effects and energy-boosting properties. Interestingly, posca was also an economically clever invention. Poorly stored wine tends to turn into vinegar, so instead of wasting it, Romans repurposed it into this widely consumed drink. Do you think you could handle the sour taste of posca after a grueling day as a Roman soldier? Well, if you can't, how about gulping down a savory meal with beer like the Roman soldiers? Beer in ancient Rome? Believe it or not, it existed, but the Romans weren't exactly fans. They considered it uncivilized, dull, and even distasteful, a drink for barbarians rather than sophisticated citizens. But that didn't stop Roman soldiers stationed in Gaul or Germania from drinking it. After all, when in enemy territory, you make do with what's available. These battle-hardened Roman soldiers would reluctantly sip these local beer, convinced it was inferior to wine. Speaking of wine, it was everywhere in the Roman army. Alongside water, posca, and beer in the northern provinces, wine was a daily staple. But don't picture soldiers indulging in the fine vintages enjoyed by emperors or senators. Their wine was often sour, acidic, and barely drinkable by today's standards. In fact, it was so strong and unrefined that it was typically diluted with water, both to make it last longer and to prevent intoxication. But wine wasn't just about enjoyment, it was also a matter of survival. Soldiers were often sent into unknown and dangerous territories, where clean water was scarce. Since wine had natural antibacterial properties, it was much safer to drink than questionable water sources. In some cases, wounded or sick soldiers were even given higher quality wine as a form of medicine. Today, would you trust ancient wine to keep you healthy? Interestingly, Romans saw drinking pure, undiluted wine as a barbaric habit. Even the Greeks and Romans who enjoyed good wine typically mixed it with water, reinforcing the idea that moderation was key. For soldiers, this had the added benefit of keeping them disciplined. Drunkenness in the ranks was never a good idea when you might have to fight at a moment's notice. But did Roman soldiers rely only on rations? While the army provided food, many soldiers received care packages from family and friends. Letters discovered from ancient times reveal that loved ones often sent gifts of food to keep their soldiers well fed, and maybe even remind them of home. But soldiers didn't have to rely solely on these gifts. The Roman army was always followed by merchants, opportunistic traders who set up camp near military bases, offering everything from fresh food to luxury items. Of course, these weren't charity workers. They sold their goods for a price, and soldiers had to decide whether to spend their hard-earned wages on better meals or save their money. But have you ever wondered how these Roman soldiers survived when supply lines failed? Even with their well-organized food warehouses, the Roman army often found itself operating far from home, deep in enemy territory. To keep the soldiers fed, crisis food warehouses were set up in the rear, stocked with food that was either confiscated or outright plundered. Clothing and footwear were also obtained in the same way. But supplies weren't always guaranteed, and when shortages hit, soldiers had to fend for themselves. In these cases, soldiers became farmers, foragers, and hunters. Some tilled fields and harvested crops using their own sickles, while others herded animals or gathered fruit from the forests. The Romans even had specialized roles to support the army's daily needs. The frumentatores gathered grain and other crops, while the aquatores collected fresh water. Then there were the lignatores, who gathered firewood, and the pabulatores, responsible for finding food for the army's livestock. And last but not the least, the pecuarii, who tended to the army's herds. These roles might not have been as glamorous as fighting, but they were essential to keeping the Roman war machine running. Meat in this period was often scarce, so soldiers resorted to hunting in forests or taking livestock from local populations. The lands used specifically to supply food for the army were called prata or territorium, essentially turning occupied regions into temporary military farms. Can you even imagine being a Roman soldier, expected to fight all day, only to be sent into the fields afterward to harvest crops or track down firewood? Would you have survived in this system, or would you have found a way to requisition food the easy way? Roman soldiers knew that food was fuel for battle. While they were given rations, many spent their own wages to improve their diet, whether by buying better food from merchants or receiving care packages from home. After all, marching for miles and engaging in brutal combat required serious nutrition and energy. And really, has much changed? Modern soldiers also buy extra food, energy supplements, or protein-packed meals to stay strong before going into battle. The importance of a well-fed warrior has remained the same throughout history. And after 20 years of loyal service, Roman soldiers didn't just retire with honor, they were often rewarded with land. These land grants let them raise livestock and build a stable life after years at war. Some Roman leaders, like the famed Marcus Porcius Cato, even wrote detailed guides on animal breeding, proving that raising the best livestock wasn't just practical, it was a point of pride. What do you think? If you were a Roman soldier, would you have stuck to your rations, or would you have splurged on something tastier to keep yourself in top shape?